Hello, everybody. My name is Ahmeda Mansaray-Richardson. I am of West African heritage, and I say that because a lot of who I am as a Jesus follower is built upon who I am as a person of African descent. So, in my cultural tradition, we tell stories. We're storytellers. I come from a line of storytellers on both my mother's side and on my father's side. In my mother's tribe, and I hesitate to use that word, but I guess that would be the most familiar word for most people. They are the Gon people, and within the Gon people, she comes from a group of people called the kingmakers, or the custodians of the stories. And then on my dad's side, they are Mandingo, and the Mandingo people they just tell these heart-swelling stories of who they were and who they are in spirit, but who they are not right now. And who they are not right now is a consequence of the colonial history that beleaguers and plagues the African continent even till this day, with very restrictive neo-colonial policies. And I set that, as depressing as it is, as the stage for this narrative on forgiveness from the Christian tradition, because it is very important to me at this journey as a Christian to understand that, I'm a Gon first, I'm a Mandingo first, and then in the mix of that, I encountered Christianity. So that's my stage setting. Forgiveness. I went to boarding school. It's not uncommon. It's also a vestige of our colonial history. The Brits thought it very wise to create these beautiful campuses with grand imposing buildings where they gathered all the really smart ones and taught them how to be really good micro-Brits in our black skin, so that they would feel comfortable when they finally left the country, that we would continue the legacy of what it means to be, good subjects of Her Royal Majesty. I broke free, hello. I'm here today. But in my boarding school experience was where I encountered Christianity. And if you can imagine, I was sent to boarding school at a very young age, so I was away from my parents, and all that was familiar to me. And what I was given to keep me warm at night, proverbially, were these quips, these Christianese things that they said. So when you were bullied, it was like, forgive and forget. When you were hit, it was like, turn the other cheek, so that, because Jesus says, if you're hit on one side, you need to turn the other cheek, and you'll be hit on the other side. Or stories like, we have in the Christian tradition, we have what we call the Lord's Prayer, or some people would call the Disciples' Prayer. And there's a line in it that says, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who have debts against us. So that would also be thrown in your face. Well, if you don't forgive them, how do you expect Jesus to forgive you for all the bad that you are? So imagine that is my perspective of what forgiveness is coming up. It is a must. If you're to be a good Christian, you better figure out the magic that is forgiveness. Otherwise, you are in great danger of hellfire and brimstone. And I came up in that narrative of Christianity, where it was either you were good and you forgave, or you were bad and you didn't forgive, and so you suffered eternal damnation. Can you think what choice I picked? I always was on the side of forgiving. So when somebody did something wrong, you had to be the first to say, oh, it's okay, I forgive you. It's okay, I forgive you. It's okay, I forgive you. Almost like, how are you doing? I'm fine, thank you. You're not fine, but you say I'm fine, thank you anyway. Well, now I'm a mom. I've got these 5 little humans. I like to call them my little humans. And it has become even more important for me to situate how I raised them as little boys of African descent living in downtown Toronto, and how I share my faith with them to be authentic to where I am at really in my faith, not the stuff that was thrown at me and that I sort of put on as my mask, my persona. And in this process with my boys, I have gravitated to two stories in the Second Testament. Other people would also refer to it as the New Testament, where I think Jesus, who is the central character in the Christian story, historically, as we like to believe, where Jesus engages with these two women from marginalized parts of his community. These stories resonate really deeply with me, and I'm going to share those stories with you. How am I doing for time? I'm good? Okay, perfect. All right, so I won't read the stories, I'll just kind of sketch them. The first story is told of this woman who's had this issue of blood, and she's been bleeding forever. If you're bleeding for more than a few days, it feels like forever. And so in that tradition, she would have been on the outside of community. And this lady is audacious enough to show up in the middle of crowds of people who are following Jesus, knowing that but just by virtue of her being there, she's making everybody unclean. She's breaking some serious ceremonial rules, but she's heard of this guy Jesus, and this guy Jesus has the power to stop this issue of blood that she's been dealing with for, I believe it's 12 years. So she risks everything. Well, some would argue she had nothing to lose anyway, and she touches the hem of his garment. Now, Jesus is on his way to somewhere very important. This really important guy whose daughter is sick, and I can imagine Jesus's people, the people who were doing his PR, would be like, yo, you gotta get to this guy, he's very important, he's important to the Jewish people, so you've gotta get to help out his daughter. And then this woman, this nobody, this ostracized ex-person comes into the story and has the audacity to touch Jesus. And she touches the hem of his garment. Some would say the hem of his garment would have symbolized his authority within the Jewish community, but I will leave that for somebody who is well versed in those issues to unpack. But audacious enough to touch. And he is, and I will throw in the word here for your consideration, he is forgiving enough to stop the whole charade and ask, who touched me? Duh, who didn't touch you? But Jesus asked, who touches me? And then what really captivates me in this story is that when she is emboldened to say she was the one who touched Jesus, the interpretation goes, Jesus allows her to speak her whole truth. And for a woman who's been living on the outside of society, I can't imagine like that, but she would not be looking at Beth with the sign that says 5 more minutes, 1 more minute. Like, she took the mic and she spoke her whole truth. And everybody had to listen. They had to listen. She held them captive and spoke her story of marginalization, her story of exclusion, her story of pain, of suffering. And everybody in that, I don't know, hours maybe, had to pay attention and hold this space of forgivingness that would bring her in many ways back to wholeness. And I looked up the different definitions of forgiveness. I won't bore you with that. That would be for my paper for Pam. But there's the Greek definition, the Hebrew definition, the Germanic, the English definition, which comes from the root Germanic word. And a lot of the themes are around wholeness, making whole, removing shame. And in that moment, I like to think that there was this mystical thing that happened where this woman was allowed to finally be made whole by Jesus stopping and asking, "Who touched me?" There's another story which I love so much. This lady who was sinful comes to a place where she ought not to be, Simon's house, where Jesus is, hanging out with this Pharisee, and a Pharisee are the really pious guys. And she just creates this scene and is kissing him and wiping his probably dirty feet with her hair, and Jesus lets it happen. And everybody around him is befuddled, to say the very least. Like, why is he allowing this sinful woman to touch him? Once again, this idea of touching. And then Jesus introduces, in this case, he's being very direct, and he introduces the language of forgiveness when he says to her, "Your sins are forgiven." After he tells Simon, who do you think will love more? That the person who is forgiven little or the person who is forgiven much? Clearly, this woman feels like she's been forgiven much, and so much is her love. Jesus stops this party, allows this woman to create this scene yet again. And note, the whole thing about women, I am kind of on that tip. But he allows this woman who, according to the hierarchy of society, is pretty low on the totem pole, but he allows her to stop the party, allows her to create the scene, allows her to touch him, and in that process creates, or at least begins, her journey of being made whole. So when I think of who I am as an African, when it keeps me up at night, when I see stories of these young boys of African descent being shot in the back, walking the streets of North America, Europe, the places where they don't officially belong or are not recognized as human. When it makes my insides get all, because I think that could be one of my 5 sons. And I want to get all self-righteous and be so mad. I think of these stories where if only I could get myself to that place where I'm allowed to be touched deeper than just the horror of what's happening, like to that space where I'm compelled to hold space for other people to tell their stories and be made whole. Perhaps in that mystical space, I can also experience my forgivingness, and I can pass them on to my sons and their journey on this planet, and maybe their journeys as Christians will help them to be made whole too. Thank you.